Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Tarek Alawis, and I'm the chair of Middle Eastern Studies. And on behalf of my co-host, Susanna Heschel, chair of Jewish Studies, who's following us on live stream from Hamburg, where she's on research leave, I would like to welcome you all to this event of the Dartmouth Dialogues. I would like to first thank our sponsors. I would like to thank the Dean of Faculty, Elizabeth Smith. And I also would like to thank the Dickey Center, our partners in holding these events, and the staff, everyone Judith, Larth, everyone who's been very, very kind of involved in making sure that these events are being, getting the advertising and also the logistics and the live streaming and all of that. I would like also to thank Jennifer Thomas from Middle Eastern Studies, who's worked so hard also on organizing everything. As this is part of an ongoing series of events, some of them are held online and some of them are held in person as well. So Professor Azzeddin Fashir, my colleague, has a series of webinars that are also open to the public, and some of those who are joining us also on live stream are having the opportunity to follow these events. And these events are really part of an ongoing commitment to education in times of crisis, in times of great violence, that also needs to be confronted, especially in an academic community, by also looking at history, by looking at context, by examining different aspects of historical narratives and examining causes and effects, and also trying to imagine a future that might come out from this examination as an academic community that comes together, that think, that talks, that engages. So with this in mind, we have speakers for you today who are going to think about the topic and present on a topic that is extremely important, that has been transformative in the history of the region. We talk about certain events like the Balfour Declaration or 1948, and the fall of the Caliphate in 1924 is as cataclysmic and transformative, not only in the Arab world, but also from the Balkans to the Caucasus, affecting all the way to Indonesia, wherever you have a Muslim community that was thinking about itself and its identity in relation to this caliphate, the century-old institution that was abolished in 1924. So tonight we have three speakers. The opening remarks will be given by Montgomery Fellow, President of Kosovo, ex-President of Kosovo, Atife Ayahyaga, who is currently at Dartmouth, visiting professor at Dartmouth, and who's been thinking about questions of tolerance, about community, about sovereignty, authority, minority rules, about democratic processes through her work politically, but also through her foundation, and also through her classes and through her activism at multiple levels. And this is a very important topic, of course, when we think of ex-Yugoslavia and the importance of the Ottoman Empire there. This is at the heart of some of the questions we have here. The two speakers who will be in dialogue talking about the effects of the fall of the Caliphate are Yoav de Capua from UT Austin and Jonathan Lawrence from Boston College. Yoav de Capua is a professor in history at University of Texas at Austin, and he's a historian of intellectual movements in the Arab world in the modern age, focusing, his first book is Gatekeepers of the Arab Past, Historians and History in Egypt, and his second book is No Exit, Jean-Paul Sartre, Existentialism, Jean-Paul Sartre, Arab Existentialism, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Decolonization. And he's working, Yoav is an interlocutor, and so is Jonathan, interlocutors who've been also thinking about these questions of the Middle East or engaging with these questions for a long time. It's not his first time at Dartmouth in this capacity. He's a Guggenheim Fellow, and also his new book is dealing with Arab revolutionary movements in from the 1940s and 50s onward. And he was here actually in October giving a talk on this topic. Our second speaker or interlocutor with Yoav is going to be Jonathan Lawrence, who's also an interlocutor. Jonathan Lawrence is professor of political science and the director of the Clow Institute for Constitutional Democracy at Boston College. And Jonathan's most recent book is Coping with Defeat, Sunni Islam, Roman Catholicism, and the Modern State. So it's really at the heart of the topic that we will be exploring today. Jonathan also has written a lot about Islam in Europe, the emancipation of Europe's Muslims, integrating Islam, religious and political challenges in contemporary France. And so he's been thinking a lot about these questions in a kind of a wider transnational diasporic context. Jonathan is also a former fellow at the American Academy in Berlin, the Wissenschaftszentrum also in Berlin, the Transatlantic Academy at the German Marshall Fund, and also at the Brookings Institute. So I'm very, very happy they are here. They accepted our invitation. And we're going to start with President Yahyaga giving the opening remarks. Please join me in welcoming them.
Well, good afternoon. It is a really great pleasure to join you all today, and thank you once again, Professor El-Aris, for extending the invitation for me to be able to be with your audience today. As we reflect on the centennial of the fall of the Ottoman Empire, I am glad to share my thoughts on its profound impact in the region and beyond, with a specific focus, as you already mentioned, on the Balkans. The Balkans, situated at the crossroad of civilization and cultures, have long been influenced by the ebb and flow of empires and ideologies. The demise of the Ottoman Empire ushered in a period of a great change as the new nation-states emerged and old power structures dissolved. First and the foremost, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire marked the end of the centuries-long Ottoman rule in the Balkans, and perhaps one of the most significant repercussions of the Caliphate's fall was the emergence of the competing models of the political authority in the Balkans. Territories that were formerly part of the empire were looking to establish their own nation-states, marking the beginning of the new era of the sovereignty in the region. This process of nation-building reshaped the political map of the Balkans and laid the foundation for the modern states that we see today. Western powers played a pivotal role in this regard by partitioning the Balkans and contributing to the redrawing of border. For instance, the Congress of Berlin in 1878, convened by major European powers, resulted in the reconfiguration of territorial boundaries in the Balkans, including through the imposition of external control over the certain region. As territories formerly under Ottoman control were looking to establish their own statehood and assert their independence, this process of political and the social transformation was also accompanied by tensions, conflicts, and territorial disputes. The emergence of new forms of governance, ranging from authoritarian regimes to nascent democracies, presented a new set of challenges as newly independent states grappled with questions of legitimacy and how to build their nations. Against this backdrop, religious and ethnic divisions were often exploited for political gain, leading to cycles of the instability. As a result, the region experienced a period of geopolitical upheaval with different ethnic and religious groups seeking to carve out of their own sphere of influence. I should note the profound influence of the fall of the Ottoman Empire on the self-determination of the Albanian people. Prior to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, Albanians were under the Ottoman rule for centuries, during which time they experienced a complex relationship within the empire. While some Albanians held position of power within the Ottoman administration, others resisted Ottoman authority through various forms of rebellion and defiance. After the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the Albanian people had the opportunity to assert their identity and pursue their aspiration for self-rule, laying the foundation for the modern Albanian state and shaping the course of the entire Balkan history. It is important to mention that during the Ottoman rule, the region and places like Kosovo experienced the establishment of the Islamic institutions, the construction of mosques, and the introduction of the Islamic legal and educational systems, a historical legacy that has left a lasting imprint in Kosovo's Islamic identity till today's date. However, Albanian identity in Albania, as well as in Kosovo, is deeply rooted in the shared language, history, culture, and traditions of the Albanian people, an identity that was reinforced after the struggle for independence from the Ottoman and later other imperial control, fostering a strong sense of the patriotism. After Kosovo experienced years of occupation and oppression, including our recent history and experience with conflict that added with NATO's humanitarian intervention, it is important to note that in Kosovo, and for the Albanian people in general, the national or ethnic identity has always been primary to the religious one. Today, 16 years after declaring our independence from Serbia, Kosovo is a secular state which guarantees the separation of religion and state and protects the rights of individuals to practice their faith freely. We are also a multi-ethnic with a diverse population consisting of Albanian, Serbs, Bosniak, Roma, Turks, and other ethnic groups. Although the majority of population are nominally Muslim, in Kosovo, Islam has been practiced as traditional Islam, and whereby moderation and tolerance are two valued and carefully guarded principles. In spite of the peaceful interfaith coexistence for centuries, the attempt revival of the Caliphate by terrorist groups like ISIS in the recent years has reignited debates about the role of Islam in the public sphere and the boundaries of the political authority. For Kosovo and the Balkans more generally, the collapse of the Caliphate and the disintegration of the Sunni religious authority have opened up new possibilities for political and religious expression. While the appeal of the extremist ideologies may seem distant from Balkans, the region, my dear friends, has not been immune to the spread of the radicalization and the violent extremism. In this regard, we have been quite firm that Kosovo and the region shall not present a breeding ground for the extremism. But to maintain this effort, we needed and we have to work together and strengthen our resilience. Civil society organizations, religious leaders, and grassroots movements are working tirelessly to promote dialogue, to promote tolerance and reconciliation across ethnic and religious divides. By acknowledging the past and confronting its legacies, we can build a more inclusive and peaceful future for all communities in the Balkans, but not only. As we reflect on the centennial of the fall of the Caliphate, let us all remember, my dear friends, the lessons of our history and the enduring legacy of this pivotal event. We need to reaffirm our communities to build a future based on tolerance, based on dialogue, based on mutual respect, and based on the coexistence, where the diversity of our region, religion, or community is celebrated as a source of strength and not as a source of the division. So once more, Professor, thank you very much for inviting me, and I wish a very fruitful discussion among two excellent doctors today, Jonathan Lawrence and Yuval Di Capua. I had to excuse for my bad pronunciation. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much to Tarek El Aris and to Susanna Heschel, who is watching from Hamburg. It's a pleasure to be here. So the Gaza-Israel war has brought relations between the Arab world and the West to a new low, which has spurred the U.S. and its partners to work feverishly towards the creation of a Palestinian state. The National Security Advisor and former Dickey Fellow, Jake Sullivan, said that the only long-term answer here is a two-state solution. But I'm here to argue that the assumption that the major unresolved issue at the heart of the Israel-Gaza war is the issue of Palestinian statehood is actually misleading. Because if you look for what the major breach of trust that shaped the current moment, you could argue that the original Nakba, or catastrophe, was in fact the destruction of the last major Islamic caliphate a century ago, on March 3rd of 1924. The Ottoman Caliphate had endured for 4 centuries, making it the second longest caliphate in Islamic history, and it's one of only a handful that successfully defended control of the religion's holiest sites in Mecca and Medina and Jerusalem. Now, we are used to thinking about the Republic of Turkey as the reason why there is no longer an Ottoman Caliphate, and that is technically true. Ataturk, the first president of the Turkish Republic, did push to abolish it in 1924, but Turkey's formal act of abolition was merely the coup de grace. It was just the finishing touch, because for decades before that, the European empires had actually campaigned quite systematically to destroy the religious authority of the caliphate in those lands that they came to occupy, around the Balkans, North Africa, throughout the Middle East, but also in the South Asian subcontinent and in Java, what would become Indonesia. So between 1870 and 1920, around 200 million Muslim citizens came under non-Muslim rule of those European empires, leaving only around 12 or 15 million or so living under the rule of the Sultan Caliph in Istanbul. Now, London, finding itself in possession of tens of millions of Muslims living in India, waged a global campaign to persuade Muslim and other public opinion that the caliphate should not be ruled by Ottoman Turks, but rather by an Arab of the Qurayshi tribe. And in particular, they had a preferred candidate, who was then the Sharif of Mecca, named Hussein bin Ali, of the Hashemite clan. So the stated aim of the British, which was then joined, in fact, by the French and the Dutch and many others, was to return the caliphate to the Arabs, take it away from the Turks. Now, paradoxically, this at first strengthened the international profile of the caliph, but as the empire was gradually eaten away and the European occupiers exerted greater influence over their subjects, it proved to be impossible to recover. So the British invented a mufti for Jerusalem, for example, and they empowered the Sharif of Mecca. The French created a Western caliph out of the Moroccan sultan, who became a king and the commander of the faithful for the Maliki rite of Sunni Islam. The Austrians did the same in Bosnia. The Russians did the same where they had pushed out the Ottomans in Crimea and elsewhere. And the Dutch did the same in Java. So by the end of this period, by the late 19-teens and the early 1920s, control over Islam's three holiest sites in Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem had been handed over from Ottoman allies into the hands of British allies. So in that process, which took place over decades, the European empires did more than just replace a figurehead. They actually uprooted what was a centuries-long international network of religious knowledge and religious training that took place through the nonprofit sector of charities, libraries, seminaries, religious courts, and the like. So centuries of global Islamic community under one caliph were essentially divided into dozens of nation states overnight. And with it, the religious authority was also shattered and fragmented. So these events, they seem rather far away. They seem a bit obscure, honestly, but they're not merely historical details because they left, I think, a lasting scar in the relationship between Muslim populations and Western governments, or what we think of as the international community. Because combined with harsh secularization measures across most of the region that followed in this era of nation states, it also contributed to the impoverishment of religious knowledge for generations, and we're actually still feeling some of that impact today. Now, I don't wish to overstate the profile of the Sultan Caliph, right? The Ottomans had never enjoyed total consensus among all the world's Muslims, but they did play an important role protecting the relics, defending Jerusalem and the two holy cities. Their policy of pan-Islam maintained thousands of mosques and seminaries and legal institutions in and beyond the empire. And despite pressure from those European forces that were occupying Muslim populations, Muslims around the world actually rallied to the Sultan Caliph as a symbol of resistance in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, generating what the historian Mona Hassan from Duke University has called a longing for the lost caliphate. Now, one of the last caliphs with the highest profile and the longest reign was Abdul Hamid II from 1876 or so to 1908. And his popularity and fame increased with every European-backed national liberation movement or occupation, every protectorate, every colony from Bulgaria to Syria. And for decades, the Friday prayer for Muslims worldwide included a benediction for him as the sovereign custodian of the religion's holiest sites and as indirectly the successor of the Prophet himself. So the Ottoman military and the Ottoman economy are often described as the sick man of Europe, right, in the early 20th century, but the caliphate was itself quite robust. So the race to destroy Istanbul's religious infrastructure and networks has had unintended consequences that still reverberate now, a century later. One contemporaneous movement that you may have heard of is called the Caliphate movement, which was a movement in defense of the caliph's sovereignty, and it was specifically born in British-occupied India, and became a diplomatic movement as well. They even sent a delegation to the Versailles meetings after the First World War to push for the rights of the sovereign caliph in the Holy Lands. But there was another immediate consequence, and that was what we now think of as political Islam, which is to say the birth of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Ikhwan, and the Tabligh-i Jamiat, which is the sort of South Asian variant of that. Because these Islamic brotherhoods were seeking to preserve or to restore that public role that religion had under the Caliphate, which has since been which was dashed essentially by the end of it. And we can think of Hamas, for example, as one offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, but of course there are political parties, there are nonviolent organizations around the world that can trace their institutional legacy to that as well. So there's been, I would say, a kind of hole in the heart of the Islamic world, despite since the end of the Caliphate, despite several attempted conferences that were held internationally around Cairo and Jerusalem in the 1920s to consider how one might go about replacing this abolished institution. But there was never enough international consensus. There were two major objectors. One was the Republic of Turkey, which still had the relics and refused to give them up. And the other was Saudi Arabia, in fact, which had no interest in a rival religious authority seeking to share sovereignty over the Hijaz, which is where the holy cities of Mecca and Medina are. So the de facto substitution that took place was from what was relatively moderate and modernizing Ottoman Islam that was coming into a kind of symbiosis, a kind of coexistence with the international order, in part for very pragmatic reasons, because Abdul Hamid wanted to be one of the great leaders, one of the great powers, and so the constitutional amendments had brought the Ottoman Empire more in line with the European empires, and the Sharia courts as well had started to be limited to civil affairs and taken out of criminal affairs. So there were all sorts of ways in which Ottoman Islam was modernizing in some of the ways that people articulate as desirable today in the context of a nation-state order. But for those who considered the Saudi royal family or the Jordanian royal family, who are, of course, the heirs to the Ottomans in terms of who controls the holy cities of Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem, for those who consider those kings to be ineligible successors to the caliph, then Islam's holy cities essentially lost their historic sovereignty in that period. And what we have seen for the past century is a little bit of a search to try and regain that. So the disappearance of a consensual Islamic sovereign also left open the issue of how Sharia, or Islamic law, would be incorporated into the Westphalian-style national rule of law. And the contested succession left open the question of caliphal authority, and therefore of who protects Muslims worldwide, who defends Jerusalem. This has led to the emergence of various non-state actors, including extremists like Osama bin Laden or Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. And of course, the subtext of what was the operation known as the Al-Aqsa Flood of October 7th is that the current Muslim guarantors of Islam's holy cities do not successfully protect it. All right, that's what the subtext of the Houthi attacks on the Saudis are, and of course of Hamas's attacks on effectively Jordanian control of the Jerusalem Waqf of Al-Aqsa. But most importantly, there has no longer been a unified front, a unified theological front, which was about as unified as the Christian theological front, which is to say you have Catholics who follow the Pope, which are a great number, but then you also have a number who don't follow the Pope, who are still Christians. And it's somewhat analogous with regard to Islam. There were hundreds of millions who found the Caliph to be legitimate, and some hundreds of millions who ignored him. But he was still a relatively consensual figure who stood at the head of an entire caste of ulema, or legal scholars, who could provide uniform interpretations of religious law, and received many thousands of inquiries through the Ottoman office of the Sheikh ul-Islam, for example, responding to questions of how to live as a modern citizen while still being a good Muslim. So those were some of the most important ways that the challenges faced by global Islam were facilitated, in a sense, by that unified figure. So the evisceration of the office of the Caliph marked the height of humiliation, and it created a demand to fill his traditional role as a protector of Muslims worldwide. And for a century, the battle has been waged by a range of politicized religious actors laying claim to that legacy, from Al-Qaeda to the short-lived Islamic State. But the missing caliphate has above all presented an opportunity for Iran, as we've seen. Despite its status as the leader of Shia Islam, so another sect of the religion, and despite the absence of any Qurayshi or Arab tribal ties, obviously, of the rulers of Iran, Iran has other claims to legitimacy. It was the first to reverse what you might consider the shame of abolition by restoring religious rule and by rejecting its own westernized elite, of course, in 1979, and by empowering its proxies to attack the current custodians of Islam's holy sites. Iran has emerged as an unlikely defender of a new order at the center of an alliance against the post-imperial order. So Ottoman religious legitimacy, in conclusion, can be seen like a cistern of refined oil, refined over many centuries, a repository and a redistributor of inputs from Muslims worldwide. And the Europeans essentially burst that cistern in pursuit of short-term goals. Those short-term goals, we know, were temporary preeminence on the Sinai Peninsula, on the Red Sea coast of Arabia, commercial domination of the Gulf, Middle East, and North Africa for a generation or so. But when they left behind a Muslim world in search of unity and self-government. And the failure to resolve those questions left the caliphate's embers glowing, igniting a slow-burning conflagration that threatens to consume the former colonial periphery and continue inward. So any plan for a Palestinian state that ignores this crucial factor leaves itself vulnerable to future attack. So, thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to take a few minutes to pick up where Jonathan left off with the abolition of the Caliphate in 1924 and focus on the 1920s, the era after World War I, and trying to see what exactly is happening in the Arab lands that makes the abolition of the Caliphate doubly, if not triply, traumatic for the people of the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, the first factor to consider is that of physical destruction. So forget about theological formulations, spiritual framework, the kind of anchoring that the institution of the Caliphate was giving to the people, even though they did not, interact with it on a daily basis, but they knew it's part of a certain cosmology. Forget about this for a second. We'll return to that. Just pay attention to the physical destruction of the land. So normally when we think about World War I, we think about the trench warfares in Europe, this mass destructions, this senseless industrial killing. But we don't think about the Ottoman Empire as the place that actually suffered in fact the largest number of civilian casualties in World War I anywhere, where took place in the Ottoman Empire across Palestine, present day Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, and Turkey, especially the eastern side. So the forces of destruction, civilian destructions, were various. First of all, as standing armies collided and moved through the land as opposed to static trench warfare, these were still agrarian armies, still armies that needed animals' calories for movement, not an internal combustion engine. They needed food for the animals, and they needed food for the soldiers. The footprint of such an army coming out of Egypt, the British, going up all the way to Damascus is enormous. First of all, the footprint was felt in Egypt, where it was coupled with a complete ecological disaster because of water regime, hydraulic issues of irrigation of the Nile basin and the cotton fields. It took labor, peasants, to carry stuff all the way up to Palestine. Some of them still settled there in special neighborhoods in Jaffa and in Jasser al-Zarqa. These are the Egyptians who were brought in World War I, and they're Palestinians today, and they're in various neighborhoods. So it took labor from Egypt. It took the animal force from Egypt, and it took as much food and grains and whatever it could take. So the impact is enormous. Then the impact on the land itself as these armies move through. And basically think of them like locusts, right? They actually eat up their way up as they fight the Ottomans. But as it were, parallel to their movement upwards, there was also a wave of locusts that came with them, that destroyed the land. So we're talking about also severe famine. In Lebanon, it's about 200,000. These are estimation, right? No census, about 200,000 deaths and mass migration. All of this augmented, and you know that food shortages and famines are normally augmented by political factors, and the political factors is actually an sort of an embargo that was placed by the fleets of the British and the French on the Ottoman ports, on the Ottoman lands, in terms of commerce, in terms of food, in terms of the ability to move food. That's important because that contributed to the famine as well, but also to the fragmentation of the Ottomans from this entire area. So this whole area from Libya all the way up to Anatolia is one geographical unit in which commodities, people, and are being constantly moving. So this stops already before the war, but during the war. In addition, sectarianism in various places and in various formulations reach a point whereby the Armenian minorities is massacred, the Armenian genocide. That is a massive destruction of the eastern Anatolia, and all and death marches all the way into Syria, which itself suffering. So we're looking, by the end of World War I, at a destroyed landscape and a fragmented landscape. Now, I'm not saying that on top of destruction, sometimes it's easy to build a new political project, the nation state. The modern Arab nation state is built on this destruction. There's actually, it's easier for Ataturk to do that, but it's also difficult for some of the Arab elites to do that. However, it's more complicated than that because, as you might know, during World War I, these territories of the Eastern Mediterranean were promised simultaneously to three different groups. They were promised to the Sharif Hussein, who would take the Caliphate as a descendant of the Prophet and create an Arab empire of some sort. And the purpose of this polity was to unite these fragmented lands under the banner of the Caliph, sort of an Islamic banner, but basically these are Arab lands. right? So there's an effort to create something that is integrative, which is important. But the Sharif Hussein, who corresponded with the British, he was not a very good negotiator, because you needed, international diplomacy was a growing sort of it's a practice, it's an acquiring sort of proficiency that did not have. If you look at the correspondence, when you sell your car, you ask for more guarantees than joining a rebellion and declaring jihad on the caliph rather than the other way around, right? So he was basically duped. Parallel to that, Palestine, as you know, in 1970s promised to the Zionist movement with no knowledge of the caliph, of the Sharif of Mecca. And of course, the British and the French divide the region among themselves in the Sykes-Picot Agreement and keep it secret. Who is going to get what? And keep it secret. Because of the Russian Revolution of 1917, when the Bolsheviks come to rule Moscow, they find in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs these secret agreements, and they make them public. And this is how the Sharif Hussein learns that he's actually not going to be caliph. So it's actually a little bit more humiliating than, the final act of the abolition of the caliphate. It is actually a complete manipulation of the local position and the most organized local position in the region. So if we fast forward to the early 1920s, you have the French and the British settling in, taking Lebanon, taking Syria, taking Iraq, dividing the oil in Mosul, giving Transjordan and Jordan, and drawing the borders. Most importantly, the drawing of the borders. Look at the borders. They're straight borders. They're with the rulers. Churchill laughed about that. I created Jordan one afternoon, and so on and so forth. And the descendants of the Sharif get Jordan. Well, Jordan doesn't have natural resources, doesn't have hardly any population. It is not the best real estate in the region, and doesn't have any religious signifier. It did not help that the British also helped the Saudi family behind the back of the Sharif Hussein. So while the Sharif Hussein is busy somewhere else, the Saudis taking Mecca and Medina from him. So the future caliph also not going to rule over the two sacred places, Mecca and Medina. This is why the Hashemite house who rules Jordan today at least want Jerusalem, at least one Jew as descendants of the Prophet. And just fast forwarding to today, as the prize for a Palestinian state for Israelis who have a hard time, the current government especially have a hard time envisioning such a thing. The price for this will be normalization with the Saudis. And apparently the Saudis want to be not only the servers of the two holiest places, Mecca and Medina, they apparently asking for Jerusalem as well, which makes King Abdallah in Jordan now saying, really? This is a very long history of how the Hashemites are losing their holy possessions. Okay, so this is part of the architecture of the 20s that we need to understand. And the legacy of it is the complete absence of sovereignty and the ability to shape at the very basic level your political, the boundaries of your sort of geography. The Middle East is created as a highly fragmented geography, political geography, controlled by others, and as an artificial body. So before we even get to the abolition of the Caliphate, the body of the Middle East doesn't fit into the soul of the nation in a way, right? And we'll talk about a little bit what goes into this later, but and they have one name for it, which is the artificiality of this whole business of the Middle East. So if you fast forward and you think about ISIS, right, with their caliphate, as one of the most kind of viral videos, including notwithstanding all the atrocities and the gruesome ones, is relatively bloodless. I think it's completely bloodless video whereby they cross the border from Iraq to Syria through this checkpoint of the border that for them is the checkpoint that the British and the French decided in the Sykes-Picot. And they make this video and they say, well, we just canceled the Sykes-Picot. So what does it mean? First of all, this time is alive in their in the political memory like it was yesterday. It's not a history class. It's not what happened in the 20s. It's alive. They're canceling this, but by canceling it, this is also uniting something, right? So the need for integration, the urge for integration is something that is going to be with us. And I'll say something about another person who tried to integrate the Middle East along different lines, Gamal Abdel Nasser, the Egyptian president, and so on. So that's sort of one thing. So when the caliphate is finally abolished, it's a process because first, the sultanate, the actual governance, is separated from the spiritual faculties and the legal faculties of the caliphate. First, they're separated, and then eventually they're completely. Actually, I think he got a 24 hours notice, the caliph, to get to the Orient Express and move to Europe. So it was very quick. But once that happened, it also happened in a context that is extremely painful, the 1920s. And here the focus, first of all, just to say there are at least 13 different attempts after 1924 to reclaim the caliphate. Not one, but 13. I mean, Jonathan referred to the congresses and so on. It all happens there, and it doesn't only happen in the Middle East, of course. But there is something else which is extremely painful that we also need to pay attention to is the situation in Cairo, in Egypt, which is society that have the deepest experience of the modern world, about a century by that point. The most significant bourgeoisie, the biggest economy actually in the region, the cotton economy, and it's the most developed in terms of modernization and the press, and of course the university as of the middle 20s in the Middle East and in Africa as a whole. So this is a very serious, this is a place that is very significant in terms of its capacity to influence the future of the caliphate, the future of the polity as a whole regionally. And it's a debate that begins to unfold in Cairo. So the caliphate, when it abolished, they're already asking, okay, who is representing Islam now? So it's the ulama, the clergy. They have Al-Azhar. Al-Azhar is the highest, the most sophisticated religious academy in the world, in that sense. And they would like to claim some space and some power with relationship to that which is lost. The moral authority of the caliph is done. Who's going to take this moral authority? Al-Azhar and the ulama. The ulama used to have this role in Egypt historically when it was a province of the Ottomans, but they lost it to bureaucrats, to professionals, to doctors, to engineers. The state doesn't need them as much as it needed them in the 18th century. So they're relatively marginalized. By now, they will control some moral sphere that is important for them. And just when they're ready to take on this role, they are amazed by the scandals, because the Egyptian state is framed as essentially a secular nation state. Popular sovereignty, there are elections. This is an era for 3 decades in which Egyptians experimented with democracy. Nobody experimented with democracy in the Arab world as deeply and as extensively as the Egyptians from the 1920s to the 50s. And during this experiment, of course, they opened the university and subjected Islamic history to investigation by Orientalist secular logic. And the kind of studies that are coming out of Cairo universities seem completely blasphemous and sort of disastrous, but also aggressive towards the possibility and the history of Islam as a religion that has any kind of political purchase. Give you 2 examples. First, one sheikh, Ali Abdel Razek, who he's actually graduated from El Azhar, so he is actually a clergy. Most of the people who are gonna graduate who are actually gonna take the cause of Islam to this day don't have serious religious education. That's very important to understand. They just simply haven't done the 12 years education. They haven't done the exam in El Azhar, the Almiya. They haven't went to the religious seminary. So he is. And so for him to write a treatise about the origins of political rule in Islam, and to suggest that the Prophet Muhammad was actually just a messenger, not a political leader, not someone who is the bearer of sovereignty, and someone who is just have, this wonderful uniting message, is actually to introduce into the political history of Islam's separation of state and church. And you read this book and you think this is basically a treatise that was supposed to be written in the kind of Islamic tradition of writing, and what they get instead is essentially an attack on the political function of Islam. And that's the big question we need to see. What does it actually mean? What is the political role of Islam after the Caliphate? There's another scandal related to that, but they're in the age of scandals, and they feel attacked from all directions. And meanwhile, if you look at the symbols of the Egyptian state, where do they look when they build their nation state for inspiration? It's the pharaonic past. It's the pyramids. When someone dies, even the first president dies, they build a mausoleum from granite, that looks like a pharaoh, in a pharaonic, neo-pharaonic style. The biggest excavations in the 1920s, Carter, the discovery of Tutankhamun and others. This is like, that's their metaphysical depth. Even though the hieroglyphics are going to give you nothing about morality. There's nothing you can do with it. It's an empty vessel in that sense, which is not surprising why the current Egyptian regime also look to some neo-pharaonic past, because you cannot weaponize it politically. You cannot say, well, Tutankhamun said this and this and that. Here's a political example of how the people are like, forget about this. You cannot argue with this language. So it's kind of an empty signifier in a way. So they're looking at a public sphere that actually has very little representation of that. I want to read you one quote that will give you a sense of the crisis with which they start their semi-independent national life. It is by Rashid Rida. Rashid Rida is a Syrian who practices in Egypt since the late 1890s. He joined Muhammad Abdu, which is a household name in a pioneer in reformism in Islamic law and thought and theology. Someone who said, well, we can actually make religious law compatible with the modern world. We don't have a language for this modern banking and communication systems and all sorts of insurance schemes, but we can make sure that by injecting reason into the legal process of interpreting the holy sources, the sacred sources, we can actually be compatible with the modern world. So he starts as a modernizer. In 1928, this is what he writes after all of this experience of the abolition of the Caliphate. He says, in a time that is afflicted by ideological, intellectual, political, communist, and Bolshevik upheavals, in a time that is strained by religious, literary, and social chaos, in a time that is threatened by women's revolution, the violation of marital vows, the disintegration of the family and the bonds of kingship, in a time in which heresy and unaffected promiscuity have erupted, as well as attacks on the nation's religions, language, and values, and its customs, dress, and origins, nothing remains stable to raise our youth and to teach them respect. I think this is the most total kind of statement, almost like poetry, and it's how compact and how concentrated it is in its critique of and fear of the modern world. For them, they are cast into the abyss. There is actually nothing, no anchoring, no anchoring point, no place from which to legislate, to think, to create a community. And now it's no community. These are citizens. They're individuals. It's all privatized, and there is no framework. This moral crisis, this fear immediately, and now I'll just give you broadly two trajectories and I'll wrap it up. This created two things. First of all, it's not by mistake that in 1928, just as these words are written, the Muslim Brotherhood are established precisely for that. In order to, they thought about it as kind of a YMCA thing, and that was their inspiration. The inspiration was kind of, they saw it from Christian charities in Cairo, of all the foreigners taking care of the youth. They were afraid of losing the youth, and they need some framework. So it's about moral reconstruction, giving someone a core. It is, and the founder himself did not go to Al-Azhar. He is not a serious religious authority in that sense. He's coming from a different education system. So that's one project of moral reconstruction, and the need to save the subject, to anchor them, to give them something. For those who are not, most of the people are illiterate. Now they're migrating to the cities to work. This is a social crisis. I should also say the depression hits Egypt very strongly in the 30s, and an opium epidemic as well. I mean, it was very serious. That would give us, eventually political Islam. Political Islam is born right there as an outcome of this period. And violence is not on its menu. That's not what they're doing. It's not what, so the question is, how did they get there? How political Islam and violence become intertwined, and how violence become the means with which to bring back the Caliphate. That's one question. The other one that comes out of this is the question of sovereignty. Who is the sovereign? Under the Caliphate, God is the sovereign. The whole apparatus underneath is an interpretative structure that mediates the divine into daily life versus various, legal instances, educational, pedagogical, spiritual apparatus, and so on. In the era in which there is no caliphate, the sovereignty of God is robbed from God, and is being given to mortals, human beings. Popular sovereignty, what is it even? Who gave these plebs the right to put someone who would legislate, for example, that prostitution is legal as it was, right? Or that you can consume in all these fancy bars that Cairo had as much alcohol as you want. And it's not surprising that all of these fancy bars are being burned down in January 1952, and the members of the Muslim Brotherhood had serious hand in that. So the question is that of sovereignty, and eventually they would have someone who would reclaim sovereignty, Gamal Abdel Nasser, embody it in a way that is really going to trigger the other Muslim Brotherhood, mystify them completely, as Nasser stole from God something, and he would assume the role. Essentially, I would argue, Jonathan, I would interested to see what you think about it. He would say, I'm going to liberate the Arab world, I'm going to unite it. I'm going to unite the whole Arab world, not just the Eastern Mediterranean. From Morocco to Kuwait, this whole thing is going to be one big Arab empire, bigger than the Soviet Union, bigger than the US, and will have unity as well. In a way, would it be fair to say that he took the role of the Caliphate? That he took some of the historical assumptions of it. I'll stop here, and we can discuss some of these issues. Thank you.
So those are very fascinating remarks, and it immediately makes me think about this question of sovereign Islamic rule on earth as kind of a goal that has been elusive and fixed. It's not only Islam that sees itself dispossessed of political power, right? This is a broader secularizing trend with the modern state and a displacement of religion from the public sphere and from public policy more generally. And so one kind of tantalizing counterfactual that I find in all of this is, this period between 1922 and 1924. So when the Sultanate was abolished, but the Caliph was left in place, and you referred to this as a rather dramatic moment of separation, because essentially at that point you had the head of government, who was the president of the Republic of the emerging Republic of Turkey, but the head of the religion, who remained the Caliph in Dolmabahce Palace, or in Yildiz Palace in Istanbul. And of course, Ataturk was too jealous of his own control over the emerging republic to countenance a rival source of power. So in a sense, this is like a very Turco-Turkish story about the personality of Ataturk. And his unwillingness to accept. But, imagine what if an Islamic sovereign had been left in place, in much the same way that the Italian nationalists stopped at the gates of the Vatican in 1870 after they took Rome. They stopped at the gates. They left the Pope there. They took away all of his political power, but they didn't eliminate the office. They considered doing what the Turks did, which was, putting him on a train somewhere or a boat somewhere. But they didn't. They left him in place. And of course, there was a Roman question that then followed for almost 60 years before the Vatican city-state was recognized. But this period of crossing of the desert, if you like, for Catholicism was not so dissimilar to this introspective question that Muslims have asked themselves since the end of the Caliphate, which is that, is there anywhere on earth where where our religious rule is intact, where God's shadow can rule on earth? And the solution for Catholicism was this very elegant micro postage stamp size state, the size of Central Park, right? Which is obviously in the city of Rome. And you can imagine something elegant like that for Islam, but the major, so there's sort of two major problems. One is that the institution, as I was trying to illustrate, had been kind of emptied of its content, so that the Caliph was, in a sense, left without much of a playing field, without much of an empire. And there was this other sort of very ethnically driven campaign to put Arabs back in charge of Islam. Now, so on the topic of Gamal Abdel Nasser, there are many ways in which an Arab caliph is sort of out of step. It's sort of anachronistic at this point, because the demography of Islam has surpassed the Arab phase of Islam, right? Arabs are now a small minority of global Islam, and the Turkic and the Indo and the Asiatic and every other ethnicity essentially outnumbers them. And so this is one, I guess, speed bump, for any kind of purely Arab solution, or as you were implying, the British had promised essentially this possibly sort of Central Arab Republic of some kind that would unite all of these peoples, but ultimately the competition amongst these strains of the religion and the sort of the geopolitical powers that put themselves behind specific ethnic winners or losers kept the religion too fragmented, right? And so the smashing of the Caliphate was a very symbolic act, but it's very hard to put back together. I think everyone has seen that as a result.
So let's just stay for a second. I have a question about the Vatican and the Italians, because when the Turks abolished the Caliphate, it's only the first step. What they do also is declare total war on Islam. And that is they dispossess the clergy of any standing in terms of giving them control over the legal system, the educational system. Religion can become a private issue. If you want to be a Muslim, that's nice, but you would also institute a change in the dress code across. And you actually, they went to some, think of laïcité, think of France, okay? That's basically what they went with. Total separation of state and church, but also actually an active war against any organized role of religion in society, including in family affairs, a step that would never happen in the Arab world, actually, including in family affairs, divorce, inheritance, custody, issues like this. Of the most radical experiment ever in Muslim plans, I think, if I'm not mistaken, is the project of Ataturk to, not simply the Caliphate, but religion as a whole. We know from looking at Turkey today that it actually didn't work. It's interesting. It didn't work. Came back with vengeance, came back in different ways, and so on. But the sense is that there is actually a war in Islam from within. So I can see a situation where the young Turks Ataturk and who build the republic actually could create some continuity. Whereas in Italy, my question is, what was the role of the Catholic faith for communities, for people? Maybe it was impossible to declare war of it. Maybe it wasn't, Mussolini had his chance. That's the next time you have someone who can actually orchestrate a national move of that. Why didn't they?
Mm-hmm. Well, the anti-clerical period in Italy was a bit earlier, so it was the period of the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, and that coincides also with the you have the beginning of the Third Republic in France, but you also have the unified Reich of Germany, and all of these powers actively seek to undermine the institutions of the Catholic Church because they see the Pope essentially as the Caliph is seen by these occupying empires, which is as the source of potential political disloyalty, right? And so just as the Caliph was always feared that the Caliph in Istanbul would declare jihad against the British and the French, this was one of the motivating aspects that pushed them to kind of replace him. And interestingly, that turned out to be correct. He did declare jihad against the British and the French in 1914. Not against the Germans. The Germans were his allies. But by the time he did so, interestingly, the political and religious roles had already separated for much of the world's Muslims. So what you describe in Turkey had already taken place as far as the world's Muslims were concerned, because they had their spiritual leader in Istanbul, and then they had political leadership in the form of whoever had taken his place. And so that so the anti-clerical period in Europe is earlier, and what Mussolini is doing by recognizing the Vatican is actually restoring. He's doing a little bit of the counter pendulum, which is to restore some of the church's erstwhile role in public life under firm control. But what Ataturk did winds up being a prototype for what the North African leaders would do after the French left. So Bourguiba, Boumedienne, Hassan II, all of these leaders of the Maghreb who succeeded the French Empire after the independence of the North African states from Paris, they essentially did exactly what Ataturk had done. And of course, Ataturk and the Young Turks had themselves enjoyed a certain period of exile in Paris during the Third Republic, where they might have absorbed a lot of these secularist, anti-clerical ideas that they were implementing. And of course, if you look at the laws and the constitutions of the late 19th, early 20th century in Turkey, it's lifted wholesale from the Swiss and the French constitution. So there's this sort of very self-conscious European secularizing attitude. But that is, in a sense, the dilemma of the post-European Middle East, is that Europe, the European forces left, right? The militaries left, but they left behind essentially their choice of rulers, and their choice of rulers tended to be of this same school, which was highly separationist and not terribly practical. And what you describe in Turkey is also, you could say that, if you look at Western Europe today, like, what are the conservative forces? In a sense, we are still reacting. That's still a reaction against the extremes of the French Revolution, the extremes of having deracinated a lot of the population from their cultural and religious heritage, which had devastating short-term effects in Europe because it left people vulnerable to the nationalists and the various totalitarian ideologies, not unlike the contemporary Middle East, where when you sort of deforested it of the very significant institutions of religious knowledge and clergy and ulama, all of that, you similarly left people vulnerable to ideologies that were entirely divorced from the civilization.
So I think I'd like to circle back to the question of violence. Where does violence enter the question of the abolition of the Caliphate? Because initially, there is, you should say that the force in Europe early and organically in the Middle East from outside and not organically, the force that is trying to take from the Caliphate or from this kind of Islamic polity, its force is the nation state. It's antithetical in every aspect to a decentralized Islamic polity, which is multi-ethnic, lingual, geographically displaced, and so on. So the nation state is also the force that declares and enforces monopoly over the usage of violence. There is inability to have, an Islamic brigade or, an Islamic police force even to enforce personal conduct, just to make sure that everyone is pious in the neighborhood, that there is no drugs, no prostitution, sort of to create a moral core. That's a job that some organizations, some groups take voluntarily. The Muslim Brotherhood took this role voluntarily just to save themselves, right? They thought that, the only way to frame it is an Islamic framing, and the state is not doing that. The state is weak anyway, but the state is not interested in it already appropriated pedagogy and education. It doesn't actually give them anything. And the seeds of violence, and it's not called jihad or anything like that, is the desperate effort to enforce a sort of a moral code of behavior in cities, especially. And that is a very difficult proposition because the cities are actually quite cosmopolitan. In fact, the main cities run on various languages. They have a lot of foreigners. If you look at the city map, it is lifted out of it is a copy of the French capital of Paris, but it's like Havana, Buenos Aires, these kind of cities. So it's an effort. It's a struggle that they lose every day. The city defeats them, and it defeats a moral sphere, and it defeats Islam, and it's a sign day in and day out for this kind of corrupting force that by now is not a corrupting force over there. It is corrupting your soul, your inner core. And now the problem, it is not simply the problem of the institution of the Caliphate, it is symbolic in how it actually maintains this kind of moral order. It is a personal pain. It is your effort to save the community, the neighbor, to create a way out of this abyss, some form of community. And this is when they transition to enforcing, this moral sphere by persuasion and so on, but eventually by shutting down all sorts of institutions and individuals who are disturbing. And of course, there's a police, there's the state. You cannot just go into a neighborhood and shut down the bars and the brothels and so on and so forth and beat the people you don't like, the criminals and so on. So it becomes a split. It becomes a hidden, kind of action-oriented. It's all men, by the way. I mean, there is going to be a parallel thing, Muslim sisterhood, there's going to be a parallel, but, there all of a sudden there's a realm that is the responsibility of man, of purifying, of clarifying, of restoration, of putting back in order. And it has to be done by force because there is no other way of doing that. And it has to be done secretly. If you think about this split goes with the Muslim Brotherhood to the rest of the 20th century. And what exactly now you can see it in Hamas, for example. Hamas started as a charity organization, just like the Muslim Brotherhood, that, as you know, in the 1980s, the Israelis actually kind of encouraged as a counterpoint to the secular revolutionary Che Guevara's of the Fatah and PFLP and so on. And it seems that they're busy in a moral, doing this moral sphere. But sure enough, they developed a military wing as well. And then a political wing, a triple wing. And the three actually are, I would say, it's an ecosystem of three organizations that need to come up with one message, but not necessarily telling each other or coordinating before an action. And that has been historically. In Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood gave up this military under horrible suppression. And what you got is organization that only interested in this thing. And by now they have a name for it. They call it jihad because it was not called jihad. The concept of jihad was the prerogative of the caliph to declare it, and it's a state obligation. So the state says, hey, the crusaders are coming, or there is a threat, or we need some kind of effort. We need people to come to the cause. And it's decentralized, and people came out of, depends on the period and time and so on. But you can think that they went to it like they went to do public works, build a bridge or a dam or something along these lines. Well, the caliph is not there anymore. So who can declare jihad? What happens with this notion after that? It's completely privatized. Anybody can grab it. And when I say anybody, really anybody. And the people who would claim to declare jihad in the rest of the 20th century don't have a religious knowledge deeper than ours necessarily, really. I mean, in terms of really legal, philosophical, theological depth. And in the end, they will say, listen, it's not only that it is not a collective, religious obligation. It is now becoming a private obligation, especially after the 60s, where you have to go. This is one of the things you have to do as part of the other 5 things that you do as a good Muslim. You go to Mecca and you give alms and you pray and all of that. That kind of becomes, in the late 70s, become the 6th thing, that even a treatise that says this is the forgotten, commandment, the 6th one, which is jihad. And that is in the absence of any kind of authority, that is complete anarchy. And it's the same word, jihad, but completely different meaning. Nobody in the 19th century, upset as they were about their Christian neighbors, is going to declare jihad there was no vocabulary for this, no imagination for that. Coupled with, the presence of foreigners, the presence of the State of Israel, the project of a hold of the State of Israel, there are multiple opportunities to declare jihad 5 times a day, essentially.
Thank you. We will take some questions now, and I know there are some mics that will be passed around for those who would like to ask our guests some questions about this. Maybe I will start, Jonathan, I will start with a question. Could you say more about, especially with what's happening today with Al-Aqsa and the idea of a Palestinian state or creating a Palestinian state, and how you started your talk? Could you say more about that and how the question of Al-Aqsa and the sovereignty over Al-Aqsa is fundamental in this kind of, negotiation of prospect and where things might go there?
Yeah, well, no, it's a very good question. And Yoav touched on it with this question of who essentially holds the keys to the Al-Aqsa complex. And this was initially settled. So when Sharif Hussein's plan to stay in Mecca and Medina did not work out, his sons were made the kings of Transjordan and of Syria. But of course, the French removed one of them from Damascus, and he wound up in Baghdad. So you had the descendants of this Hashemite tribe in charge in Baghdad and in Amman. And of course, Saddam Hussein is the one who finally rids the Iraqis of theirs, but there's one left in Amman, and he's in Washington right now, actually giving a press conference. And what he's worried about, of course, is that his rights to this complex will somehow be negotiated away. Now, when the Israelis took the East Jerusalem in the aftermath of the 1967 war, they actually seized the Al-Aqsa complex, they seized the Esplanade, they raised the flag. But the general in charge there, who was Moshe Dayan, I think, after a day or something said, take down the flag, retreat. This is a bad idea, bad optics. And in fact, we should allow the Jordanian Waqf, so the Jordanian charitable organization under the authority of the king, to be in charge. But they kept one key, right? They kept the key to the western gate. Why? Because for the Jews, it is also a holy site, of course. They were there with their archaeological claims and their suspicions that they're the site of, one of the holiest sites in Judaism is perhaps around there, and it's where some Messianic Jews want to build the third temple. So there are competing claims on the Esplanade. So this is a sort of additional complicating factor, because you can't so easily simply say, okay, the Sauds and the Hashemites are going to share this because they're the Jews, or to say, well, in fact, we actually have we're guaranteeing the security of this zone right now. And we have our claims. And of course, they have their own extremists who are willing to go to great lengths to keep that access. And so when it comes to settling the issue of a Palestinian nation state, right, that sort of almost seems a lot more straightforward, right? You can say, all right, there's, you have the problem of contiguous territory, you have the problem of interlocutors, there's, a million problems, but nation states have been born of such, crises before, and it's certainly envisionable that a viable Palestinian state emerge from this crisis. But what's harder to imagine is an immaculate consensus over the status of Al-Aqsa. precisely because the Hashemites are not looking to have their the football taken away at the last minute by the Sauds, and the Israelis, of course, are not going to forego all claims to the area.
And it's actually also connected to the question of Eastern Jerusalem as the future capital of the Palestinian state. So if East Jerusalem is the future capital of the Palestinian state, why would the Palestinians have be in control of Al-Aqsa as well?
Right, and this is why you might think that a kind of Vatican-style solution for Al-Aqsa would be the neatest, right? If you could figure out a broad enough consultation. Now, obviously, those Caliph conferences were trying to do that in the 20s and 30s, but there were real diplomatic obstacles. And you could say that maybe today, of all of the ugliness and horror of the past season, maybe today the one silver lining is that there's some alignment of pragmatists that would find some kind of acceptable compromise that would allow access to these holy sites, and in a sense separate them from this very kind of everyday problem of, okay, where are the borders of a nation state and who protects them?
Sorry. Okay, Bill. Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much. I have a question about the infamous Caliphate, this kind of catastrophic experiment of ISIS we experienced. Now, I was also struck. I also watched on the news following, the horrifying news from Syria and Iraq just a few years ago. And I was also struck by this, by what you described, this ceremony of some ISIS fighters standing out, which I thought was interesting. But I know there's not one answer. The Muslim and even Arab Muslim world isn't a monolith by any stretch of the imagination. But from, I'd say, central voices, right, predominant voices in political discussion since the failure of the Caliphate, of the so-called Caliphate, has that discredited the nostalgia? Is that seen as a temporary failure, but there's still longing for a caliphate? Has that discredited any nostalgia for a caliphate?
I think it really kind of depends where. I think the issue now is that of collective trauma, sort of across the region in general. So is the caliphate a solution to this trauma? Is someone proposing it? Sort of not, there are always people who propose it in the same way that there are always people who want to build a third temple in Jerusalem, right? So it's always kind of there, but okay, forget about the fringe. No, I think there's also the Arab Spring that for the most part did not yield the expectations that people wanted. I mean, you could see that people bet on that, on a viable nation state, not on, I'm no expert on Tunisia, but there were the most serious conversation, really political, theological efforts. I mean, Jonathan, you know this thing better than me, sort of to do something. So I would say it's not an option. But look, who's the one most enthusiastic about ISIS? It's Europeans. It's Muslim immigrants, second, third generations in Europe. They flock to ISIS more than Palestinians, more than anybody else, right? But dozens of thousands. So a lot of the foot soldiers and some of the most gruesome it's actually people who grew up in Europe. I don't know, it's in Molenbeek or it's in, the Banilou or the UK. So why that is the case? Why is it European second, third generations are flocking to this caliphate? What was this caliphate about? And I think it really was about self-purification, the sense that the self is contaminated, is destroyed, the fact that your parents were humiliated, this kind of transgenerational trauma that goes, the broken masculinity, of course, and we know psychoanalytically that when you need to, the urge to purge the self, that the sense that something is contaminated throughout history it opens the door to the most horrendous forms of violence.
Hi, thank you for joining us today. It's a really interesting conversation. I had a somewhat similar question. The conversation we had focused, it seemed like, mainly at the elite level, and I'm curious about the Caliphate in public consciousness, both at the time of its collapse and kind of up till today. So we just talked about the end point of that trajectory with ISIS, but I don't have a real sense of, where the Caliphate is in the heart or minds of Muslims around the world during this period between, the mid-20s and today. Is there, you see these groups spawning, arguing for Caliphate, but they don't seem to go anywhere. They don't seem to light a fire under Muslims all around the world. Was the idea already dead by the time the Caliphate officially collapsed? Was the idea dead in the heart of Muslims, or is something happened over the interceding decades that's kind of led to its demise?
So I'll take a quick crack at that. At the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, you had technological advances such as portable audio abilities, right? You could all of a sudden you can make recordings on wax cylinders, these Edison cylinders that were used to record sermons and which were used to bring the caliph's sermons and those of supporters of the caliph around the world. You also had the advent of cheaper photography, and so all of a sudden you could also have portraits of the caliph that could travel widely around the world. And you add that to steamships. There's sort of a number of events that have a confluence that conspire to elevate the public image at a time when actually the same technologies were working in favor of the Pope as an international figure. And so the more that the more humiliated, if you like, that your average local occupied population felt under the boot of European Army X, Y, or Z, then the more romantically one might sort of behold this image as a kind of dream, as a dream of revenge, the dream of kind of self-justification. And what happens is that the audience for that is simply fractured by the nation state. It's fractured by this move to empower the Arabs over the Turks. It's fractured then by the new post-colonial map of dozens of nation states, where you have dozens of ministries of religious affairs, dozens of ministries of waqfs. So it's diffuse. And the al-Baghdadi moment that came in July of 2014, and sort of 4 or 5 years, it was I guess many people were surprised by how seriously he was taken in a way. He did receive various oaths of loyalty, bayah, kind of from different groups that had previously sworn their loyalty to Al-Qaeda. So, there was this kind of resistance axis that aligned behind him. But his, the methods of ISIS were not crowd-pleasing, methods, right? And so they were designed to appeal to a very hardcore of adherents who could come and live out their violent fantasies, whether they were coming from Western Europe or very disproportionately actually from Tunisia. And so there, but the idea is, I think, resonant when you have moments of Western occupation of Muslim countries, right? And so what happened in the early 2000s, well, Iraq, Afghanistan, et cetera, come under literal, again, military occupation, just as they had 80 years previously. And so it's natural that there would be a kind of search for, a figurehead, some kind of symbolic resistance to that. But right now, the ultimate obstacle is that of unity, right? Of sort of, it's impossible to imagine a candidate who would actually attract enough consensus, which is why some kind of shura, council of wise people, is a more likely future outcome than any kind of endowed individual.
Okay. On this note, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Everyone, thank you to those who are attending us on the audition. Thank you.